Hello, everybody. Well, it's me, Cody. I'm back. I'm back on This Is Your Brain on podcasts. Yay! Hooray! I hope that you've been enjoying kind of the different things that we've been trying on this podcast. I've really kind of been aiming to make it a open discussion for as many people as I possibly can. I'm happy with the way that it's turning out. I feel like some discussions are being had that I don't think would have been had on this podcast if I was the one who was conducting the interview. So that's kind of what I wanted to do by opening up the hosting gig of this podcast to my lovely girlfriend Tiara Penner, and I think she's done a really good job with the podcast that she has hosted. So for this podcast, this is actually another new thing that we are trying out. It's something that I've really wanted to do for quite some time now, and that is podcast recommendations and reviews. So I'm calling them podcast R&R for obvious reasons, recommendation and reviews. And basically with these episodes, each episode is going to be dedicated to one podcast that I listen to, and I listen to a lot. And I've written a recommendation and a review for it. You can find all these recommendations and reviews at fsproductions.ca. It's under recommendations and reviews. There's probably 15 already done, just in written format. And I wanted to turn it into kind of like a podcast, like an audio format, because I think that it holds value. And again, it's the kind of the aim of this podcast, and it's to maybe find you some podcasts that you will also enjoy. So all the podcasts that I have recommended and reviewed, I must say that I find myself I've either listened to every single episode that has been released by that podcast, or well over like 100 hours of that podcast, because there's some podcasts that just have too many episodes and I would spend all my time listening to that single podcast. So I would consider myself maybe a little bit of an expert on these podcasts, I guess. Maybe not an expert, but at least I know what I'm talking about, so that my recommendations and reviews for these podcasts are going to be from a place of knowledge and not just I listened to a couple episodes and this is what I think of it. I have consumed, if not all the content that they have, a lot of it. So, yeah. So, like I said, my recommendations and reviews are coming from a place of knowledge and experience. They're not just coming from I listened to a couple episodes and this is what I thought of it. The reason I wanted to do this series as well is I feel like if there's anything that I am a master at and that I've put my 10,000 hours into, it's listening to podcasts, because I get to do that all day at work. So, 6 to 8 hours of my day is filled with podcasts. So that's quite a bit of time. And I would say I'm approaching probably close to 10,000 hours of podcasts listened to. So I wanted to share that knowledge with you. I'm kind of going through these podcasts so that you don't have to. So if you are curious about a podcast, listen to or read the recommendation or review I do, and you can kind of find out about it. And obviously these reviews are going to be very subjective. I'm going to try and keep it as objective as possible, but I am a person. I have my own preferences and opinions and likes and dislikes, so it's all subjective to me. So take it with a grain of salt, but this is the things that I will like about the podcast. I always do likes and dislikes about the podcast. I'll give you a little bit of background information on the host as well as the podcast itself, and I will also recommend some of my favorite episodes. So I hope that you enjoy this episode, and we're going to get into the first one. And the first podcast that we are going to review is the Making Sense podcast with Sam Harris. So the Making Sense podcast actually used to be called the Waking Up podcast, and that's when I started listening to it. It was the Waking Up podcast. So the Waking Up podcast is primarily a discussion-based podcast that explores topics such as spirituality, morality, neuroscience, free will, technology, politics, and a bunch of other stuff. It's kind of like there's no subject that's really off limits with this podcast, and the more controversial the subject, the more Sam Harris kind of seems to be interested in it, which is kind of cool. It was started in September of 2013, and the podcast is obviously hosted by Sam Harris. Each podcast is primarily a discussion between Sam and the chosen guest. Sometimes it's just the two of them. Sometimes it's multiple guests. He's also done like live discussions in front of crowds, and also like podcasts where he does small discussions, but he puts like 3 or 4 of those on a single podcast. So it's many different discussion-based formats, I would say. The podcast has received critical acclaim and was included on Business Insider's 2017 list of 8 podcasts that will change how you think about human behavior. The podcast also received a 2017 Webby Award for People's Voice in the category of science and education. Those are just some accolades of the podcast. I don't know. That never really kind of informs my decision on what podcast I'm going to listen to, if it's on the top charts or whatever. I just kind of pick things that I'm interested in. It is interesting that it does say that it was included on 8 podcasts that will change how you think about human behavior, because I definitely think that this podcast has changed the way that I look at certain subject matter, for sure. There's definitely some discussions that Sam Harris has with other people that are just so enlightening and so like mind expanding, and like I find myself working and listening to Sam Harris sometimes, and it's just like, whoa, this is crazy. I can't believe this is happening right now. But it's such a good podcast for that too, because it's just like it's very objective. Sam Harris tries to be as objective as possible when you as possible as you can when you have your own platform that is filled with your opinions. So that's what I really appreciate about the podcast, honestly. So just a little bit about Sam Harris, who is the host of the podcast. So Sam Harris is an American author who has written books such as The End of Faith, The Moral Landscape, as well as Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion. He's also written a book called Free Will, which is really good, and I highly recommend you read it. It's only like 50 to 80 pages long. I forget. It's a really, really short book, but it basically goes into the whole issue of free will and what Sam Harris thinks about free will and stuff like that. It's really interesting, and I highly recommend that you read it. I've also read Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion. That one was pretty interesting too. It's like primarily kind of a book on meditation and stuff like that, and basically just how you can live a spiritual life without the guise of religion and stuff like that. So it's pretty interesting, and those are the only 2 books I've read, but both of them I enjoyed quite profusely, I would say. So Sam Harris is also a cognitive neuroscientist. He's a blogger, and he obviously hosts a podcast. He is a critic of religion and a famous atheist. If you listen to the podcast even a little bit, you will get that, like 100%. He is definitely an atheist, and he harps on religion quite a bit. He actually really harps on Islam most of all. He has a real problem with that, and I can see where he's coming from. I don't necessarily if I agree with all the things he has to say about it, but I can definitely see where he's coming from, because he's a very articulate person, and he makes his arguments, like he lays out his arguments really well. He concerns himself with matters of spirituality, terrorism, ethics, and morality, and argues that science answers moral problems and can aid in human well-being. Sam Harris is a strong proponent of secular meditation practices and studied meditation with Buddhist and Hindu religious teachers in India and Nepal. Sam Harris has a Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy as well as a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. So he actually, when he does get into stuff concerning neuroscience and stuff, he actually knows what he's talking about. He's a PhD. He's a very smart person. And he is a big proponent of meditation. Like, he basically, I think it's almost every guest, especially if they're talking about stresses of any kind. He asks them if they meditate, and especially if they are maybe a little bit more of a brainy person. He always asks people if they've tried meditation, kind of like Joe Rogan asks everybody if they've smoked DMT. Sam Harris asks everybody if they've tried meditation. So he's a real big proponent of it, and honestly, if anybody other than like Buddhism, like the whole Buddhist tradition itself, if anything has made me want to try out meditation for myself, it is the Making Sense podcast for sure, and Sam Harris, because he really, really goes on about the benefits of it. And he has a couple of episodes that just dive into meditation and meditation practices, and they're like guided meditations. So that's kind of cool too. He also has actually the Waking Up app, which is a meditation app. But I feel like I personally haven't delved into it at all, but I feel like it's a little bit more than just your basic meditation app. It's got little lectures on it, guided meditations. It kind of builds a community around meditation in that app as well, I believe, from what I know of it. So it seems kind of interesting, and I've always maybe kind of toyed with the idea of downloading it, but I don't know. I don't use apps that much, to be honest with you. So another app just it's just not my thing, but it might be your thing. Who knows? So I guess some of the good things about the podcast, I would say, is that there's a wide variety of interesting and intelligent guests who are masters in their fields of study. All the guests that he does have on are competent individuals who know what they're talking about. You know that they've been like vetted, and you know that they are speaking at least the truth as they see it, which is really awesome. And it's cool to listen to all these masters in the different fields, because they don't just explore like neuroscience or anything else. They like go into the topics of like death or technology, how technology changes our lives and stuff like that. And there's some real good ones on technology, history, stuff like that. Anything where people know what they're talking about, Sam Harris is willing to talk to them. I would say that Sam Harris is a well-spoken individual who is able to convey his ideas in a clear and concise manner, which is actually a lot harder than it seems. After doing a podcast for so long and doing multiple podcasts for so long, it's actually really hard to, and also DMing is another perfect example of this, but it's actually really hard to get what's in your head across to other people with using only your words. Like things are so different in your head, and to try and convey what's in your head to other people is a skill in itself, I think. And I think a lot of people maybe lack that skill. And I'm not saying I'm a master at it either. I'm definitely not. It's a hard thing, and it's maybe one of the reasons why we have so much conflict over ideas, I think, because a lot of people just aren't able to properly convey the messages that they have in their head to other people in the world. So Sam Harris is really good at that, and it keeps discussions kind of on topic, and they don't really get off topic too much, which is good. Sam Harris also invites people on that he disagrees with to have an honest debate. There's a couple episodes that are just like almost strictly debate episodes. The one that's just off the top of my head, he had Jordan Peterson on, and him and Jordan Peterson debated for like 2 hours, getting nowhere, and it was really hard to listen to, honestly, because they got hung up on some things. But it's cool that he does that, because the problem with the internet and podcasts in general is they can sometimes be an echo chamber. You're only going to search out podcasts that you maybe agree with, or things on the internet that you maybe agree with, and that kind of causes confirmation bias, and like it gives an echo chamber for yourself, and being like you're filling your world with only the opinions that you agree with. And it's then when you come across a different opinion, or somebody having a different opinion, you're shocked, or you're like, how could that person hold that opinion, because you don't have it, and nobody really has that opinion. But I think it's healthy to acknowledge that people have different opinions in the world, and Sam Harris does a really good job having people on that he disagrees with to have an honest discussion about the subject matter and to like kind of hash out those ideas. I would say that Sam Harris is very rational and level-headed in his search for what is objectively true. And that's the thing about this podcast is that Sam Harris is always looking for the truth. Even if the truth means that he is wrong, he is searching for the objective truth, which I think is a cool way to go about doing a podcast because he will admit when he's wrong, and that is just a skill in itself for sure. He's also willing to explore topics that other people may not be willing to delve into, because he has his own audience. He doesn't do advertising, or he doesn't do your basic ad model for podcasts. I think actually there's no ads on it whatsoever except for his own products. So like the app and stuff like that. He's not beholden to advertisers, so he can say whatever he wants and he can explore topics that people might not be willing to touch, which is kind of awesome because you want discussion about these topics. You don't want any topics to be taboo. You want to have open and honest discussion around these topics because that's how we learn, that's how we grow, that's how we change our opinions if they need to be changed. So I think that it's really cool that he does that, and I'm very appreciative that he does that, and it's definitely a cool thing. But just saying, now we're going to get into like maybe some things that I don't like so much about the podcast, but just touching on that last one is, how he's not beholden to advertisers. When I started listening to the podcast, it was actually free. It was like when it was called The Wake. But since then, he has changed it to a pay model. So basically how it's done is you have to donate. I think it's at like samharris.org or whatever. But anyways, you have to donate on a monthly basis to the podcast, or else you only get half the episodes. And honestly, I know he's very upfront about it, and he says, if you can't afford to donate to the podcast on a monthly basis, that's fine. Just send us an email, and we'll give you a subscription for free for a year. And that's really cool that he does that. But honestly, I've stopped listening to the podcast ever since it became kind of like a pay model. Because, and I don't know, maybe I should get back onto it and stuff, but because I do really appreciate the content that he releases, and like I said, it's one of the podcasts that has changed my opinions probably on things the most. So maybe I should toss him a few bucks now and then so I can get access to the podcasts again. But yeah, so it is a pay model, so you only get half. I just don't like the way that he gave you, make it a pay model or don't make it a pay model. Don't kind of make it a half pay model, give us half the episodes. I see why he does it, because it's way more that's obviously the most enticing advertising you can do to donate to your podcast, right? Is give people half the content and then say that to listen to the rest of this conversation that was probably riveting to begin with, you have to pay for it, which is, I guess, everybody has to make money. Everybody has to, especially if you're doing it for a job. If that is your job, I see why you would want to do that. It's just something that I'm not the biggest fan of, obviously. Even though he says, if you can't afford it, he will front the cost for you. It's just something that I like my podcast to be easy and accessible. And I do contribute to podcasts that I enjoy, right? But I like it to be my option. I like to donate, $5 a month to the podcasts that I enjoy. And they've always given me free content, but I like it to be my option. I don't like being my hand to be forced to pay for the content, which I don't know. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm the reason podcasters can't make money. But like I said, I do donate when possible. Another kind of downside to the podcast is that some of the episodes are very intellectually dense, and it can be really hard to follow if you're not paying close attention. And even if you are paying close attention, sometimes they're using just like verbiage and like words that are just large and very intellectual, and they're having like a PhD level discussion. So for your average person or your person who's working while trying to listen to this, it can be very hard to follow along sometimes, and you can just end up completely lost in the middle of the podcast. So that can be an issue. it just kind of goes to show kind of like the caliber of the podcast. Like it is very intellectual, which is good if you want to learn stuff. But like I said, if you're listening to it while you're working and you're listening to it while you're doing something else, which I feel like most people, like probably 90%, maybe if not higher, of us are listening to podcasts while we're trying to do something else. So that can be kind of hard with this podcast, especially when they really get into the nitty gritty of some things. Sam Harris can get caught up in intellectual beefs he has with other people. I don't know if he's still doing this, but like in some of the earlier episodes of the podcast, he would start off the podcast with something that he called housekeeping. And it was usually a Twitter argument or somebody had tweeted something at him, calling him a liar or something. And it's like, okay, I get why you're doing it, but also it's easy to skip over too because he does do it at the beginning if you want to just skip over it. But I don't know. I found it kind of like sometimes he would really get into it, and it's just like, man, it's just Twitter, dude. Just leave it alone. Like, drop it. It's okay. Somebody called you a liar. Or somebody said you're not telling the truth or whatever. Like, I get it, and I get why that can be damaging to your reputation and stuff. But also, just like, I don't know, leave it alone. I guess it's kind of annoying to drag your whole audience into a beef that you have with one particular person or persons. So sometimes he can get bogged down in terminology, which I feel like it was very evident in the Jordan Peterson podcast that he did. I think they argued over the word truth for like an hour and a half because they had different interpretations of the word truth. And I mean, it is a benefit to be clear and concise with your words and to, I guess, try to understand that you are both using the word in the same way, but also an hour and a half argument over the word truth. It's really hard to listen to. And there's a couple other examples where that kind of does happen. And like it's just hard to listen to, when you're getting bogged down over terminology and you as a third person observer of the conversation can be like, okay, like you get it that, these two people are just disagreeing over the word, but it's kind of like, when people talk past each other, or when you're like, again, you're witnessing an argument and like people are literally saying the same thing at each other, but they're still somehow disagreeing over it. Even though they're saying the same thing, they're just saying it differently. So they think that they're arguing, it's like a crazy phenomenon when you actually witness something like that. But sometimes that seems to happen on the podcast, and it's a bit frustrating, I would say. I kind of already covered this one, but he does have strong opinions on the negative side towards religion, especially Islam. And he really harps on that a lot. And if anybody he is talking to kind of even mentions that they might slightly be religious, he kind of zeroes in on that a little bit. And he really tries to kind of like pick that apart almost. And it can be just like a little unnecessary, I feel. We all believe in stuff, and our beliefs are our own, and as long as we are a good person and we're not trying to force our beliefs onto other people, I think that we should be allowed to believe in what we believe in, no matter what the religion is, as long as that religion doesn't cause harm and stuff like that. So I don't really I don't really agree with him on the fact that atheism is the way, because he kind of treats atheism as its own religion, and it's kind of funny. So, yeah, I don't really like that he kind of does that towards religion. At least, and then the final thing I would say about the podcast is that a lot of the interviews, and especially the earlier on podcasts, are done over Skype, and there's some technical issues that you can definitely hear, and a lot of talking over each other and stuff like that. It's definitely gotten better, and but like the interviews has definitely been cleaned up a lot, and I can't really fault him for having bad quality interviews, because like every single podcast I've listened to, no matter how big or how famous the podcaster or podcast is, there's always technical issues. There's always muddy audio. Sometimes, the conversation is great, but the audio just kind of gets fucked up a little, and I've done it myself. So, I mean, I can't fault him for bad audio quality. And also, with COVID, I've had to start doing a lot more online interviews, and it's a lot harder than it seems. So, I mean, I am now kind of in that same boat. I used to hate interviews over Skype or online interviews and would refuse to do them, but it's kind of the way the world is working right now. So I get the struggle and I get how hard it can be. So I'm very sympathetic to that. That's kind of all the pros and cons I would say that I have for the Making Sense podcast. I hope that I referred to it consistently as the Making Sense podcast. I might have used the Waking Up podcast and Making Sense as interchangeable. So I guess the final things that I would like to say about the podcast is I'm just going to give 5 episodes here that I would recommend you check out if you are interested in checking out the show. And I'd recommend that you do, especially if you're looking for something that's a little bit more intellectually heavy. If you're looking for information, if you're looking for different opinions on things, then I would definitely recommend this podcast for you. It's not a gossip podcast. It's not a, he said, she said podcast or a gotcha podcast. It's like people sitting down and having a discussion and trying to figure out what is true. So it's really cool. So I would say the first episode I recommend is episode number 11, which is called Shouldering the Burden of History. And that's Dan Carlin, who he has on there, which is really cool. I love Dan Carlin. He's like the person who got me into podcasts, basically. He is the host of Hardcore History and a big history buff. And that was a really awesome discussion. The second one is episode number 71. It's called What is Technology Doing to Us with Tristan Harris. That was very eye-opening. It kind of explores basically what social media is doing to our psyche and to our mental health and stuff like that. And they really get into it, which is really cool. Episode number 87, which is called Triggered with Scott Adams. And it's been a while since I wrote this list, but I believe that this is the episode. Scott Adams is the guy who created Dilbert, and he's a very right-wing conservative. And I found this discussion pretty fascinating because this is an example of where the two people did not agree with each other. Sam Harris and Scott Adams didn't really agree with each other on what they were saying, but they were still able to have a conversation that was interesting and not just kind of yelling at each other, which is in today's day and age is amazing. So that's why I picked that one. Episode number 104, The Lessons of Death with Frank Osterseki. This one was cool. I think maybe it came to me at a time when, it's one of those things, right time, right place. I was in the right headspace to hear this and then just kind of explore death and, the lessons that we can learn from death and having loved ones die and stuff like that. And the process of grief and stuff and how that can be a teacher and whatnot. So it was very interesting. And if you or anybody is dealing with grief or loss right now, I definitely recommend that you maybe share that podcast with them or you listen to it yourself because it has a lot of really good information in it about those subjects. And the last one that I would recommend is episode number 112, which is called The Intellectual Dark Web with Ben Shapiro and Eric Weinstein. I feel like if you listen to Waking Up or the Joe Rogan podcast or any of those ones, you kind of know what the intellectual dark web is. And this one was actually a live podcast, so it was a discussion between these 3 individuals, but it took place in front of a live studio crowd, which I kind of always find changes up the dynamic of the podcast a little bit because, you're now when you put yourself in front of a crowd, you're performing. No matter, even if it is just a discussion, you are now performing for that crowd, even if you just intend to have a conversation, even if it is just a conversation for an hour and a half. You're going to look at it differently, right? Because you're trying to be funnier than you might, or you're trying to keep it more entertaining for the people who paid to come and see the podcast. So no matter what, I feel like putting a podcast in front of a live audience is going to change the podcast slightly. But this one was really good. It was funny. And the conversation that Ben Shapiro and Eric Weinstein and Sam Harris all had was very interesting. And again, it just explored really cool and different ideas. So those are 5 episodes that I think that you should check out if you are interested in the Making Sense podcast. Those were some of my personal favorites. And at the end of each of these episodes of the podcast R&Rs, I am going to give the podcast a rating out of 5. This rating is completely arbitrary and probably the most subjective thing of this whole series that I'm doing because it's what I think it deserves out of 5. So I am going to give the Making Sense podcast 4 golden frogs out of 5. I hope that you found this interesting and enjoyable and at least packed full of information, maybe to make you listen to the podcast. Maybe if you already listen to the podcast, you agree or disagree with some of the things that I'm saying. And if you do, I would love to hear it. I love talking about podcasts and I love talking about ideas. So if you do disagree with anything I'm saying, please contact me. Or if you just want to chat, please contact me. All that information will be in the episode notes, obviously. And also the full write-up of the podcast recommendation and review will be in the episode notes, or you can find it at fsproductions.ca. Thank you very much for listening to the first episode of Podcast R&R. And I hope you come back, because I think in the next one, we will be talking about the Joe Rogan Experience, the biggest podcast in the world. Anyways, have a good day. If you like this episode of This Is Your Brain on podcast, consider leaving a rating or a review on your podcast listening app of choice. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, basically anywhere you listen to podcasts, you can find us. Help us break through those evil algorithms and reach the most amount of glorious listeners that we possibly can. And let us know how we're doing. For up-to-date information on the show, you can follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For more ways in which you can support the show, visit fsproductions.ca.